there's a chart. If you didn't grab one on your way in, just pick one up. I'm not going to make you do anything with it. Mr. Rooney might make you do something with it. It doesn't look like anything because you can't really fit anything into these boxes. But truthfully, if you were to write down and know the leaders, the major acts, legislation, what's going on with African Americans, what's going on with women, if you knew all of these thematic categories, and you can go through the story, right? I'm taking you through the story in these review sessions. If you could tell me the story of African Americans from the beginning until maybe the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s, that's pretty good. You could tell me the story of Native Americans, you know, from this time. So it kind of forces you to look at time periods, but also themes. And it's something that you can use, or that he could use, but it's something that I'm going to use today to try to frame our next time frame. So today we're going 1763 to 1789, which is pretty much the inauguration of Washington. So the last point we left off through Washington. And I want to talk about all of these things at some point today. So whether you parcel out your notes like this, you don't want to take notes on here because you don't have enough room, but things that we're going to discuss, you might want to use these categories. And if not, I would probably break it down into Road to the Revolution, Revolution, and setting up the new government, or the Constitution, whatever. Those are kind of the big ideas for today. So, last we left off, how's everyone doing, by the way? Everyone good? All right, let's go. So last we left off, it was 1763. We had just issued this proclamation of 1763. The 7 Years' War was over. England was looking to the colonies, and they said, you know, we can't afford to pay for you anymore, and we have to generate revenue somehow. So the truth was that the colonies were expanding. In 1763, they said no settlement west of the Appalachians because it was too expensive for them to protect. It wasn't a direct economic sanction, but the colonies viewed that as their opportunity to get cheap land. The farther you moved west back then, where there was nothing going on, the cheaper the land was. So when we look at all of these acts, remember we did the speed dating thing back in September when you were basically a squirrely sophomore still trying to figure it out? So all of those sanctions, I think, are either social, political, or economic. And if you're ever stuck on an essay question, and you're like, oh, how do I put a framework? How do I put this into a box? In history, go social, how did it affect people? Economic, how did it affect the exchange of money or the ability of people's, wealth? Or political, right? What changed in the government? What new act was passed? What amendment was passed? So I like to go through that. So first let's start with the Stamp Act, 1765. The Stamp Act is a direct tax on paper products. So in the 1700s, what did they use paper for? Diplomas, certificates of any kind, a marriage certificate, playing cards, a direct tax by the government on any of those paper products. So, initially to the Stamp Act, the colonists, their natural reaction was to just boycott. So groups like the Sons and Daughters of Liberty organized, protests, mainly in New England, mostly in the North, in the merchant class, the people that used paper products and that was affecting them the most. And they boycotted. They said, we're just not going to buy that stuff anymore, and we'll hurt the crown in one way or another economically. And so the Stamp Act was repealed in 1766. The year later, the king says, okay, we hear you. We're not making money off of this anymore. We're going to shift our plan. So then they start the Townshend Acts, which is an indirect tax. So you're only being taxed if you decide to buy an import through France or through, the Dutch. And again, that was an economic sanction. So whether it was a direct tax like the Stamp Act or an indirect tax like the Townshend Acts, the colonies' response was to boycott and then, of course, to smuggle. And smuggling in the colonies sort of became this honorable profession. If you were a smuggler and you could get stuff for people and you can get it without the tax, people respected you. So by 1770, Britain figures this out. And they start sending waves of new troops, which is really what they didn't want to do from the get-go, right? Because it costs money to protect the colonies and have a troop presence. And by 1770, 5 people are dead in the middle of Boston Commons, known as the Boston Massacre, and it sort of highlights this showdown between the colonists and the soldiers who were there in Boston. Now, there were also stories of, there's nothing going on in the colonies, and a lot of these soldiers took second jobs. when they were working there to earn extra money, and they took jobs away from the colonists. Again, an economic opportunity, right? But it boils over in this violence in Boston. So continued sort of friction between the two. 1773, Parliament tries to bail out the East India Tea Company. They lower the price of tea, which you think would be a good thing. But ideologically, the colonists did not agree with the idea of this cheap, bankrupt tea being shoved down their throats. So no longer was that just an economic sanction, but it was sort of an ideological revolution happening here, right? It was in the hearts and the minds of the colonists that they were thinking, even though this is cheaper, I'm not playing this game, we're being forced to buy this tea. So they lowered the price of tea so the East India Company could be saved, and so that's where you get in 1773 the Boston Tea Party. You know, they dump all this tea into the harbor. They weren't sneaky about it. They dressed up as Indians. Everyone sort of knew what the game was, right? So when the Boston Tea Party hits, I would argue that Britain responds with the most swift action of all of the things we're talking about in the road to the revolution, and that's the intolerable acts in 1774. So again, if you're looking at your columns here, we're still talking about acts and legislation, or maybe major events, that would be the Boston Tea Party, major events, that would be the Boston Massacre, but the coercive acts, or the intolerables. So three main things. They're going to close the port of Boston, one of the largest ports on the eastern seaboard. That's going to directly affect the economics of the colonies. Two, you're going to repay all the destroyed property that you dumped in. You're going to pay for the tea, basically, that you dumped in there anyway. You're going to clean it up as a part of that. And then until that, we're going to reorganize sort of the way that you do business, right? They're going to put more economic sanctions on what's going in and what's going out of the colony. So economic sanctions, repaying and cleaning up, closing of Boston Harbor, etc. So there's other acts in there during this time period. Taxes on lead, glass, and tea. There was a declaratory act in 75, I think, where the Crown says, okay, we repeal these other acts, but we have the right to make new legislation when we want. And really, if you look back to what we talked about last Thursday, isn't this the end of salutary neglect? I mean, everything we've talked about in the first 7 minutes has been direct intervention in the colonies. So all of this sort of boils to a head at what the Bostonians would say, Lexington and Concord, right? Lexington and Concord, the two cities where the first battles of the war took place. Troops start to pour into the new country. There's one last-ditch effort made to the Crown. It's called the Olive Branch Petition. It's rejected. The colonies are in insurrection. Okay, basically we had broken off in firing our guns at them at Lexington and Concord. So during this time period, though, from Lexington and Concord, the ideology is sort of shifting from we don't want you ruling over us like this to a thought process of, hey, maybe we could be independent, right? What are some of the things that are the hot button issues that are pushing that shift in thinking, right? From resistance, resistance, resistance to, oh my gosh, we should just become our own country, right? Well, the first sticking point is this whole idea of virtual representation. The Crown insists that every time you guys are voted, and we're voting on something, we're virtually representing you, right? We have people that vote on your behalf and in the best interest of the colonies. But I want you guys to think about this. Even if the colonies had representation, because they represented such a small portion of what was the British Empire, right? That old phrase, the sun never sets on the British Empire, because literally they had territories all over the globe, right? So somewhere in the world it's light right now. They would have been outvoted, right? Because there would have been more representation in England than there was in the United States. So did it matter that the colonists were represented? Really? Because they never would have gotten any of the things that they wanted anyway. They would have been outvoted. So even though it's this taxation without representation, it becomes this ideological mindset that they no longer want to be a part and be a British subject, right? The colonies start to form an identity as Americans, as independent people, even though they're saying that they're British subjects, right? So now, at the start of the war, there's still 500,000 loyalists in the country. Loyalists are those who remain loyal to the Crown. Most of them were located in the South. Most of them were doing so purely out of selfish motives. They needed a market for the crops that they were selling, and England was their best customer, right? So a lot of them remained loyal. 20% of the population was pseudo-loyal to the Crown. I don't know where they come up with these numbers, but there were 2.5 million patriots, people who joined the cause for the war. The truth is, even though this is a revolution by a minority. It's a revolution by a merchant class, most likely to be in the New England area, right? People on the frontier probably didn't care. People in the South probably were shaking in their boots because they couldn't make money off the things that they were selling, right? So it's really a small, sort of white, wealthy majority that's the driving force behind this. There's a group in Boston called the Association. They'd knock on your door and they'd say, you know, join this revolution or we'll burn your business down, right? A lot of it's coercive. They're being coerced to join that. So the document, now we're in, let's see, there's a category in here. Oh, arts and literature, right? Common Sense, 1775, Thomas Paine. You have to know the date, the name, the document. That's convincing people not just to resist, but it's convincing people towards independence, right? It's actually a really easy read. I don't know if you read it in class or if you had the opportunity to read, but it's super easy to read. And Thomas Paine's Common Sense sort of leads to 1776, which of course is the Declaration of Independence. It's really more of a flashy show to the rest of the world that we're a viable economic partner, we can trade with you, we need help from you, as much as it is about, you know, when in the course of human events, this whole declaration, this Thomas Jefferson soliloquy about, you know, all men are created equal, right? But we want to show the rest of the world that we're legit, even though we're not. But we're legit, even though we're not, right? No Navy, no Army, no government, but we're legit. Trade with us, help us, right? That's really what the Declaration of Independence is about. So we need a military alliance by 1777, and of course we get it from, the French. Battles in the American Revolution that you need to know. Lexington and Concord, early on, that's a good one to get it started. I've never seen questions on the AP test other than these three. Lexington and Concord, Saratoga, which is sort of known as the turning point of the war, right? We've got the drunken, hungover Hessians fighting on behalf of the Germans, and we surprise them and beat them, and that's sort of turns us back to the positive. Yorktown is the battle that ends the war, and then the Treaty of Paris in 1783 formally lays out the ground for, you know, what we're going to do next. So Lexington and Concord, Saratoga, Yorktown that ends it, Treaty of Paris in 83. If you're fumbling for a treaty at the end of a war, go with Paris. Most of the locations of these treaties, no matter what war it is throughout history, is probably Paris, okay? But never put false information unless you know it for sure. You just don't look like you know what you're doing when you write something that's false. Don't guess. Just say the treaty that ended in 1783, yeah? 1781 to 1787, we enter into what Bailey calls as the critical period, right? Kind of a weird set of dates between independence and we have no government, no president, what's going on. The leading document that was sort of overriding the country at the point was the Articles of Confederation. Let's talk a little bit about that. So the Articles were a loose structure of laws that kept power in the hands of the states. They didn't want to create a strong federal government because they kind of felt like they came from a strong federal government by having a king, right? So let's give local control. We know that South Carolina is very different than Massachusetts, right? So let states kind of control their own area. But by 1787, sort of the end of this critical period, we start to highlight some of the negatives of the Articles. One is the inability to tax. So how do you raise money to pay for a military, for a navy, for all the, you know, the services that you need that government provides, that Mayor Rooney does for his city in Rolling Meadows, if you can't tax people? But really the bigger thing is the inability to suppress internal rebellion. Remember when we talked about Bacon's Rebellion 100 years ago, last Thursday, but 100 years ago in history, where we were like, this is the turning point. We can't use white indentured servants anymore. Now we've got to go cheap black labor, right? Shays' Rebellion is the turning point for them. These people in early American history are freaked out by internal rebellion. They want to have control over people. And so when a bunch of western Massachusetts farmers with pitchforks stage Shays' Rebellion, it highlights the need for a stronger federal government because we don't have an army that goes in there and shuts these angry farmers down. So you get this argument of the Federalists who wanted a really strong central government, right? This political group, Hamilton would be a key figure for them. Versus the anti-Federalists, which will eventually become the Jeffersonian Republicans, which will eventually become the Jeffersonians, or the million different names. But Feds and anti-Feds during this time, right? So in